Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Making the Rounds with Emily Rand and Kelsey Moser. Anyway, we're going to talk about... we're going to shift gears from talking about the release of the Persona 3 Reload to actual League of Legends topics. So, effectively, the first thing that we wanted to talk about is just dive right into it. Get into the nitty gritty of a lot of these topics that are more community focused before we get into the game stuff. The LCS Roadshow for spring has been canceled. In fact, I heard they're not even going to have a championship anymore. It's just regular season, Emily. Thoughts?
That is not true. But I wanted to talk about the roadshow topic a little bit because you and I have talked a lot about, like, through the years, especially with the LPL doing geolocation and like how important is it to have live events? What are the benefits of actually traveling around the US? I know Travis did that. So there are two things that came out that I'm going to touch upon, that just to cover the topic briefly, because I want to talk about a certain part of this topic. But I know Mark did a AMA the other day where he talked about how roadshows have a specific floor that you need to hit, just in terms of, like, there is an increase in budget from like a regular LCS day to a roadshow, regardless of where you have it, due to the fact that, you know, you have to include money for flights and hotels and, you know, etc., regardless of where you're having it. So there was that where he came out and addressed that part of it. And then additionally, there was the Travis video memeing about like, you know, the difference in cost from a regular LCS day to, again, turning on the lights in the studio and just adding like confetti guns for a finals, kind of like what we did in 2021 summer, I believe, when 100 Thieves won. Because of the resurgence of COVID, we couldn't have that in New Jersey as planned. That was why we're in Newark this past summer as well, because that was something that was kind of, we had rescheduled with that venue because we did not do it in the summer of 2021, I believe. And then like having it in a giant arena, right? And Travis's point is that there is a middle ground between LCS Studio and a giant stadium where you're like blocking off half the stadium, but you're still using, like, I think Houston was a really good iteration of this, and Houston was amazing for a lot of reasons. But I think the big one was that was our first like big thing post COVID, after like the Dome and the 2021 spring finals, which were technically like at a venue. What the heck? What was that?
I don't know. Discord.
I feel like I need to keep my arms down here because that's the second time that the computer said something fucking weird. Okay. What is going on? We had it at a venue, but there was no audience, right? That was the one where famously Sven got like super sunburnt and we had to like stop down for a bit because the angle of the sun into the actual like staging area was affecting whether players could play because sun was directly in their eyes. So yeah, his point was like there is a difference between having it in Giant Stadium versus having it in the LCS Arena. And I just wanted to talk about roadshows generally and kind of what they can bring, because I think, and again, this is something where it gets really nebulous, and I'm sure a lot of people in response to this are going to be like, Emily, you fucking commie bastard. We have to make money. Like, money has to come from somewhere. We can't just spend a ton of money and not get anything back. But like, I think the thing I really wanted to touch upon is the
Emily
And
has
I
a
can't think of
deep-seated
another.
fear of being called a communist ingrained
No,
by her
you
parents.
should.
Yeah.
Yeah, my parents.
Anyway,
When I
continue.
went home this past holiday, they kept calling me my daughter the communist, which is funny.
Nice. Okay.
But so like there's and I'm sad that I can't think of a better way to say this, but when you talk about like a return on investment, obviously there's like a monetary return on investment that you can get from partnerships, from selling merchandise, from all this other stuff. And then there is a different, more nebulous part of it, which is kind of the crux of this whole esports needs to be profitable versus esports is simply a marketing arm, and then trying to find a middle ground between the two, because it's impossible to measure
It's not.
that. Well, okay.
I just want to say right now, Ryan has measured it very poorly. I know what you're going to say. It is not impossible to measure.
Good.
Yeah.
That supports my point even further. But like,
Yeah.
You're told a lot that like it's really difficult to measure the impact
Mhm.
of an event beyond like the like essentially numbers on a spreadsheet where you're calculating like how much money you're making versus how much money you're spending to put on an event. I will say every newer LCS fan I've talked to, so like fans that have actually come into the league against all odds, since I joined the broadcast in 2021, right? So like not older fans, they're kind of hanging around, but like new people who have actually come into LCS and become fans, have said specifically Houston. They've specifically cited Houston, I think, because the storyline there was so dramatic. The plays in and of themselves were kind of insane, right? And so people remember that event, and they remember it very fondly. And a lot of people who became incredibly emotionally invested in the LCS and then did spend money and were the people who were even coming to the studio on weekdays, were it was because of an experience they were able to have. And so I think one thing that is underestimated about roadshows, or about being able to travel, especially in a country that's as large as the US is in terms of landmass, is being able to bring that experience to people, and how far that can carry in terms of anything from them just buying merch at the event to spending money on League of Legends, the game, right? So I think that's where I'm really sad about roadshows, because again, like the return on investment is not just monetary. And again, like I understand why it's happening, but I think like it's sad because I feel that, especially in North America, due to a lot of other things that we've talked about on the show at length already, and you and I have talked about like off camera as well, it's really difficult to get people in North America just interested in playing League anymore. And roadshows were actually one of the few things that did that. That either got people invested in LCS as a product, or the player, like a player, a team, etc., and then got them invested in the game.
I think it would be very interesting to run so the reason why I say it's not impossible to measure is that you have to actually run targeted campaigns at selling like a specific in-game currency or good, right? And then measure the impact of those targeted campaigns on selling. And I'm assuming like since Riot has done them in the past, they either weren't successful or the metrics that they were using to measure the impact were not great. they didn't control for variables, or a lot of what has been seen in the past, like, okay, there's a spike in sales of this champion or this skin during this champion being very popular in the professional meta, right? Being attributed to that champion actually just being overtuned, right? So being able to gauge that, but also like, you do still get, this guy played Lee Sin mid in the SK Vitality game, which we'll get to later. Was there an uptick in like Lee Sin mid being played, right? And if there's an uptick in Lee Sin mid being played, after that match, was there any impact that was remotely noticeable on like Lee Sin's skins, anything like that, right? So these are the kinds of things that I don't actually hear about. So I assume they are either being targeted and there's just like no actual impact that Riot thinks is meaningful, or they aren't looking at them, or they are looking at them, they decide it's not meaningful, and they're using very bad ways to measure it. So it's like one of those three things, and since we don't have any transparency on it, it's just very difficult. But what I always hear from Riot is that you can't measure the impact, really, but that is just not true remotely, in my opinion. So yeah, hard to say.
Yeah, I think the easiest example of this is Faker's Azir, right?
Yeah.
Because after that Azir player, he was like, after that Azir play, I think we've brought this up before, but like in that JDG series, it was sold like insane. Like it was, there was a demonstrable spike in Azir sales after that.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's very possible that Riot internally, if they are measuring the data, are attributed to, players realized Azir is broken. It's like, well, why did they realize that? I'm curious. But yeah, you can definitely measure like events. There's so many studies in economics that are economic event based. That would be just very easy to apply to situations like this. It's like, for sure, data like this is just so easy to use, honestly. So that's my main thing there. You can even give it to me if you want, and I can let you know. But the other one is when you talk about the impact of roadshows, right? I think one thing that you mentioned, like merchandise and ticket sales, one thing that I think historically we've been very poor at, one, marketing, and two, just understanding the value of, is ticket sales and merch. And I think part of the problem is the massive venues we've done and the fact that they used to sell out. They no longer sell out, or it depends on the event if they sell out, right? Like Worlds versus whatever. So now when they aren't selling out, you're for sure just losing a lot of money when you go to these massive events. So that would be another reason for Travis's advocacy there, to make the argument that, hey, like, you can make ticket sales, adjust the price, go to a smaller venue, more people will want to go because of the tickets will be priced appropriately, the correct number of people will want to go, and it's possible that the event will make a better profit just in terms of ticket sales. Also, merchandising is usually terrible at these events, I think. Like every time I've gone to these events, the merch booths are like, we have a shirt and a plushie or something like that. And it's not like, just bring all the shit. Like, I mean, I'm just saying right now, that's probably one of those situations where you're actually going to have better sales for your merch. Like the merch lines are always so long too, like to get something, but the amount of merch and what is available is usually just so low. So like those types of things, I'm assuming I'm not the only one who notices them, but also, and that someone at Riot does, but there are a lot of things that are arguably obvious low-hanging fruit in these types of instances that either don't get addressed, or there are many passionate people who want them to be addressed, and then they still don't happen for whatever reason. So it's hard to say what the reasoning is.
Yeah, I think like it's weird because I think one thing, and again, I'm not saying, because I am like very anti geolocation for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think you don't have to do it in esports. I think the Overwatch League, for example, expanding, like, there are so many issues with the way Overwatch League did geolocation. But if you look at the and again, I know you and I have brought this up before, but it is worth repeating that with the LPL venues, a lot of the times when you are having something in uh Shenzhen, or you're having something in Xi'an, it's not necessarily, and like this isn't as intended, but I think it works because, once again, China is also a country, while they have a lot more fans, it's a large country just physically. You have fans of, EDG or RNG or whoever going to Xi'an when they're playing WE at that venue. And that becomes almost like a roadshow where a lot of fans that are going to some of the games that they will hold in different stadiums are fans of other teams that are just going to the event to support their own team, or going because they want to go to a League of Legends event, which I thought was a really interesting. So it wasn't like necessarily a home or away thing. It was like we're just going because it's the closest thing to me. We can't get up to Shanghai because that's very far away. I think another thing that I do want to point out, for, again, the blanket caveat, I think the execution of Overwatch League geolocation was really bad. But I think some of their actual like homestand events were very good, and kind of a good example of like how something like this how a roadshow like this could work without in that in between area from LCS Studio to Giant Stadium, and the fact that you don't necessarily have to choose one or the other. There was one at LA Live that the Valiant did, I believe, at the time. That was very cool. I remember people saying that the Atlanta one and the Dallas one were both very cool. And this is before like literally everything went to shit in Overwatch League, and I don't think they could have done this every week with teams traveling constantly, etc. But I think in terms of an example of a roadshow and how it could work and how it could still get fans really invested in a smaller venue that's not a stadium or the LCS, there are a few in there that are pretty good examples of like from everything from like the atmosphere in a smaller venue to the way they sold merch that ended up being like pretty fun and well-run events, and people came away from them having a really good time. I know Travis also brought up the Santa Monica Airport Barker Hangar as a venue that he cited as something that's like, this is in between. It's actually super close to the studio. It gives you a different atmosphere, different vibe. It's like more people, but not massive, so you wouldn't have to worry about like selling out a stadium, that kind of thing. And yeah, it does make me sad that the impact of these things in some ways seems not unquantifiable, I guess, but like underrated, because quantifying the impact of them is just a little bit more difficult.
Yeah. And I like I said, this is the kind of stuff that I would love to personally have data on, because I think it is very doable. And I don't know, it's just it's interesting. But I'd be very curious to have access to, okay, what are what are ways that you can measure impact on game sales, because I think that would be very interesting for any kind of publisher. The other, and I'm sure there have to be papers on something like this already.
Write one.
So, I mean, if you give me data, I will. But there have to be papers on this at least somewhere, right? Because like esports has been a thing for a while. And so I'd be very curious. So maybe that will be my personal project this week, is just find the research that does exist. So the other element of it for me is merchandising. I feel like is another one of those things that is constantly said, oh, it just doesn't work for an esports audience, which I also don't understand where the data or the information is on that, because it's just not something that people have invested in either successfully or extensively. And yes, culturals are very different, and I'm going to be one of the first people who will bring this up. But like merchandising is actually very successful for like the Chinese audience, for example, for esports teams. So, and they have like extensively developed like clothing lines. Like EDG for a very long time had merchandise that specifically targeted women, and things like this that you just don't see. So I'm very curious if, like, because I haven't seen really big a team that's really tried to do merch well, except for maybe 100 with like their limited access drops, right? And how big they made that a part of their brand and identity. So I would just be very curious to see like more things like that. Like I think the C9 kind of membership sort of case drop or whatever would be interesting. But the other thing is that most of the people who tell you that merchandising is like a dead end are also people who work in partnerships and are therefore incentivized for you to believe that the only way to make money in esports is through sponsorships and partnerships and ad revenue. So we'll see. Like I guess we'll see, because right, it's not that kind of thing model is not going to work long term, is it? So who knows?
Yeah. I'd also say I think TL has done some really interesting stuff with their merch as well.
Yeah,
I'd cite them as another team that has like
made it more part of their identity, or
like when you're talking, and obviously they've done a ton of partnerships. I don't know if they had like a broader partnership with Disney. I assume so, just because a lot of their stuff through the years since like 2019, 2020 has been like Marvel or Star Wars or just stuff that's like under the Disney umbrella in a lot of their collections. But I think that kind of thing where you're having like limited edition stuff and you're kind of playing into it, I think TL has done really well. So I'd cite them. I don't know how well it's been working for them, but I think their actual like merchandise, not only in terms of output, but again, kind of like how you said, 100 Thieves made it a brand to the point where people were using it as an insult, even though they were making there's a fuck ton of money off those clothing drops, I assume. I assume that's where they make a lot of their money, actually. But in terms of
it at least was for
using
quite a while.
A similar model, I think Team Liquid's done a pretty good job.
And it's just funny because I remember this being like hurled as an insult, and certain
Hoodie org
members of 100 Thieves who will remain nameless taking it somewhat personally, and I was just like, okay, I would love to be a hoodie org, because that means you're making some money somewhere, right? You at least have a marketable element that gains some revenue. So yeah, I think I especially felt that going from EG, because it's just so funny to see how much they were invested in social media and marketing at 100 Thieves, and then you go to EG and it's like, can I get $40 for a camcorder to take pictures of my players? Maybe like that would be sick. I'd enjoy that. So
unlucky.
But yeah, it really just kind of depends. And it's gonna be so variable. So I'm very curious because I've had a lot of conversations with even NACL teams about this where it's like you don't have to win probably to create an engaging product, and it's just about how you go about doing it. That's the code that people seem to have a hard time cracking. So this is a very extensive topic, and as I get older, it's the kind of topic I'm more interested in. But
Yeah, same.
we'll see how things pan out. Also, yeah, like to your point, the venues and everything. I think, for example, one thing that I think is very cool is like the watch parties that are being held
Mhm.
in like New York City, Chicago, things like this. Like Wilhelm in chat is bringing those up. I think that would be something as like a test case that you could also even use data on and try to sell merch there. Like have a Riot person show up, do some fan engagements at those watch parties if you're a team like FlyQuest or something, send a community manager, someone to engage with the audience there.
Mhm.
Or like a team, if you're not participating in finals, send like a player, right? Things like this. And then see if you do get engagement, if you do get sales, if it does seem worth it to kind of sponsor those watch parties. And obviously that's not the most exciting because a lot of I think Riot's takeaway might be, oh, we can just do watch parties and not have really massive events at stadiums. But it's still like an interesting pilot project that I think could be a fun way for fans to engage if we're not gonna do a spring finals. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd be really curious because I remember, and I don't know if this happened at or how much it happened at LCS events, but I do remember at Worlds specifically in New York. I know obviously CLG as a brand is no more. It's now NRG, but like I know they sent their players to do like basically a fan, I think it was like a pop-up shop slash like just fan meet thing
Mm-hmm.
while uh LCS and just general League of Legends fans were in New York. And I'd be curious to see how successful that was because I did talk to people who went to it
Mm-hmm.
and they said it was great.
Yeah.
And similarly, I know there was like a pop-up shop for Caria that one of my friends went to for T1. And I mean T1 is like insanely good at doing these things. So that's that's a whole other thing because they're the most popular team in the world. So
Yeah.
obviously there's a lot of caveats that come with that. But I do know they had at least a pop-up shop for Caria that I think was sponsored by the team itself. I don't think it was a fan. They might have worked with like a few Caria fan clubs, but they they did a pop-up shop and sold merch there, and that was also really successful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm not sure how the data from that would correlate, only because, like I said, there's a lot of caveats when you're talking
Yeah.
about T1 specifically, but still, like that kind of outreach is very cool to see, and I think every single fan I've talked to that's gone to one of those events um has said like, "Oh yeah, like the CLG event was really fun.
Yeah.
Like we got to talk to the players, we got to just talk about League of Legends and watch it." And that experience translates a lot further than I think people give it credit for.
I also unfortunately think an argument that is valid is that those events will appeal most to people who are sort of already
Mhm.
LCS fans, right? So the
Yeah.
idea is if we're trying to convert new viewers, if we're trying to reach new audiences, like what is the best approach there? And I don't know if you do like some kind of bring a friend incentive or what you do right in those types of situations. But I think that there's also like that's a whole new topic as well. And I think we've already talked about
Yeah.
this for like 25 minutes or something. So
Yeah. We should probably move on.
but for sure I think it's like we could probably do a whole episode on this topic alone, most likely.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the actual video games themselves. Hooray.
Woo!
I think immediately talking about some of the broader topics and then keeping the trend of narrowing down. The first thing for me that I feel about this, and I will use this to segue into like more team specific topics, is that in the LCS, when I watch games, a lot of times it feels like they are more lopsided drafts than when I watch like LPL, LCK to an extent, even LEC. So I was curious, like, how you feel about this topic, if I'm completely out of line, or what your thoughts are.
Interesting talking, because like a lot of times I like asking pro players a lot when I get to talk to them about what we get wrong on broadcast, or
Yeah.
like what we can do more on broadcast, etc. And one thing that comes up a lot of the time is like talking about draft in a more holistic way that's
Yeah.
execution based, as opposed to like this champion is bad into blah blah blah, or like this draft sucks. But I think like if you look at the C9 draft from yesterday, if you look at the NRG draft from yesterday, just as two really immediate examples of like what is it going to take to play out this composition, and like calling up, I'll look at the NRG IMT draft, right?
That one was
Because
fun.
it was a good time. Raz and I got to talk about it. We were trying, like, again, like on broadcast, I never want to say like this is unplayable. Just because I do feel like there, even if it's a really one-sided draft, there are avenues in which like NRG can win this game, right? They're very, in my opinion, tight win conditions and a much higher level of execution, as opposed to IMT, who, as long as they're pressing their buttons relatively close to each other, probably going to do pretty well.
Yeah.
But the like, I do like talking about draft in that way, just because I feel like a lot of teams are pretty close in LCS, which is also kind of contributing to some of this, like, if a draft discrepancy is super, super high,
Yeah.
then the game, especially as a best of one, becomes a lot more volatile. So for NRG, we have Maokai, Jin, Cassante, and then LeBlanc and Viego. For IMT, we had Varus, Ori, Nocturne. So the Ori Nocturne combo, that is, I wouldn't even say rising in prio, but it's kind of been at a steady priority,
Sure.
I think.
Yeah.
And then Aatrox Leona. When you're looking at this NRG draft, you see like, okay, we kind of called the flex into support. Like Raz and I were talking about this. We're like, it's actually probably going support, might be going jungle, but probably support. The Maokai setup for the Jin. You can see how that works, right? The AoE ult from Maokai is really, really good for Jin, because Jin can just sit there and fire from the back line. And you have these pretty strong side lane champs in Cassante and LeBlanc, and then you have Viego. This comp, there were points in time where you could see NRG piloting it, and you could see that they as a team understood the win conditions of it. But again, it's just a lot more difficult than the IMT comp, which just goes in with Ori Nocturne, right? And then presumably you just have Varus doing damage, and Leona also able to ult over the top of the Ori Nocturne combo, with Aatrox going in as well. So it's as the kind of like frontline drain tank. And you could see it as soon as they got into a 5v5 position, right? As soon as NRG couldn't really spread them on side lanes, they just kind of went out. And again, with so many teams, like the really interesting thing about the LCS right now is that I actually think teams across the board are a lot closer to each other than we may have anticipated in terms of the actual rosters and players performing. And when that happens, it means that draft actually becomes even more crucial because you can have something like this, or you can have something like the TLC9 game where you're just looking at this composition and you're kind of like, what, like, how is the Lilia going to play the game? And like, what happens if this Milio Lucian lane doesn't immediately stomp? Because otherwise your win conditions are so narrow. Like incredibly narrow. Against TL, who once again they like, not only do they have range advantage, but they just press their buttons and it should work, right? So like, it's not that easy, but like, if we're comparing the ease of execution and like how these two compositions go up against each other, it's a pretty big discrepancy.
I would even argue with like the Lulu, polymorph, etc. Like and how finite the trade windows you have with like Lucian are. It's actually very difficult to even think of Lucian Melio as favored in that lane. So when I look at that draft, I'm just like, sick. We have 3 losing lanes and a Lilia with no CC. Awesome. But part of the reason why I brought this topic up is I do think part of the parity of the LCS can be attributed to how lopsided some of the drafts are. So do I think that do I personally think IMT and Energy are super close in competitiveness, or that IMT won a best of 1 with an easier draft? I guess like that's kind of one thing that I would ask also, is it's almost like a chicken and the egg question. Like and how many of these, the league is so close, can be attributed to the expectations that C9 was going to stomp everyone, and then suddenly teams are picking up wins against them. Like that's the other one that I'm curious on. Obviously, it's great for social media impressions, so I'm not gonna push on it too hard. All 8 teams are close. Anyone can win, guys. Watch LCS. It's great. Yes, continue. But but also, but I do think like there is a little bit of that for me. So yeah.
I think you could see windows of it in that Energy IMT game, right? Because there were points in time where
Energy were winning.
had they had like good map control. You could tell they understood like how they were supposed to side lane, how they were supposed to set up some stuff. So I mean, like, I feel like you could see it most in that game. I also would agree that I think part of it was just expectations preseason, where like C9 is going to be like here, and then you're going to have like NRG FlyQuest here, and then you're going to have the rest of the league kind of fighting over who is not last. And that has not happened because C9 has looked, I think, not only lost in draft. Like, I don't think, for example, if you're looking at this TL C9 draft again, their draft is obviously not doing them any favors. But I don't think their problems can solely be attributed to draft.
I agree.
So yeah, then it becomes like, okay, what is going on with the team itself outside of their drafting? I also think another thing, like just a shout out just regarding draft that I wanted to throw out is, I think 100 Thieves have had some of the most interesting and like cool drafts for that team. I think however they're doing it in terms of the players talking to Grayson and the rest of the coaching staff, how him and they got
Yeah, it's
Spooks
Spooks.
too, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How the two of them are kind of talking with the team, but like they seem to really understand the players they
Yep.
have and how they want to set them up for success. And also using, because like for example, Quid plays a lot of Aatrox. He spams it in solo queue. His pivot in that draft against Shopify into the Scion mid, that was quite clever. It was a really interesting setup and use of, again, an understanding of what can our players do together, who are these players, what can they play. So I wanted to give them just kind of a blanket shout out. I even said this to Grayson as he was walking up on stage. I was like, I love your dress.
Yeah,
Love your dress. He's like, yeah, okay. Because I've really out of all teams in LCS, I think I've enjoyed 100 Thieves drafts the most.
And I think the other thing, I'm also gonna give some credit to the players, and people are gonna say, "Oh, Kelsey's gonna bring up the players contributed draft. It's not all the coach's fault," but I'm not. Ha. Because I think the main thing is that you also have to have players who are very low ego and fine with kind of being told, "No, you're playing X," right? And have to be like very realistic about our best chance to win. And I think a lot of times you get players who have a hard time with that for whatever reason. It's like a lot of players, especially if you're in a team that's not projected to be a top team, one of the big problems you'll have is a player who wants to look good individually and might prioritize that over the overall team's chance of winning. And they might not even do it consciously, right? It might be a subconscious thing. So having a group like that where it's like, yep, they're playing champs that make sense for them. No one's having ego. This is actually a good way for them to win games. Is like, to me, you give like some credit to the players for being down for that too. And for like the coaches being able to have those real conversations with the players. So very cool. It's especially interesting because there were a lot of Golden Guardians drafts that were just so confusing to me. So seeing like Spooks and Grayson work it out is a good time. And like the DSG drafts when Grayson was on the team, they weren't very flashy, but it was like you get the job done in NACL, you play scaling comps at front to back, and you win the game. So it's all good. Let's see. I think the other thing I would bring up on draft before we move into C9 specifically is just I'm surprised like the narrative that like teams are experimenting or trying harder things. I feel like that's rarely actually the case. Sometimes they do, right? And sometimes teams will be vocal about saying that, but I would assume it would be less likely because there are fewer games in the regular season than it would be normally. So I'm not sure if that's something that we can say or if teams like NRG are just legitimately not sure how they want to play, or if teams like C9 are legitimately not sure how they want to play. And also shout out to AoE because they actually did execute a draft that was very similar to NRG's. Well, but I don't even think it was down to the Maokai Jin Viego situation. I think that was more the fact that Zamudo went Leandri's Udyr and no one expected him to do that much damage on Rift Herald. So C9. Cloud9.
Oh man. Where do we want to begin? I feel like there are so many narratives swirling out there already in terms of they're frauds, everyone on this team has an ego, there must be a ton of infighting, etc., etc. I will let's see. Where do I want to start with C9?
I'm very curious I think to hear your take because mine is
I think
maybe different, but yeah.
I am really curious to hear yours. I think an interesting thing that I have been tracking, and I have the stats up. We are missing one game, I believe, still. Because every Monday I get up because sometimes our stats don't update like ASAP on Monday. And so I message our stats guy, poor Liam,
Sure.
shout out to him. And I'm just like, hey, has this updated yet? Because I want jungle proximity.
Nice.
It's like the stat I look at the most is jungle proximity.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, we still have like one game broken. So like some of these might be off, but in terms of how off they are, it's not.
At this point, we have more
So,
games.
Yeah, it's only it may be missing one game, but even looking at it, I know when the game is from, and even looking at how these have updated, it's not super far off. Anyway, that's the caveat I have when I'm looking at these stats. But I think it's really interesting because I was initially using these to kind of look at TL. And generally what the big difference is with them this year as opposed to last year. And I noticed that UMT actually had the highest forward percentage, and their team had the highest like counter jungle percentage. And I'm like, that's really interesting because typically when I think of a jungler who is really good at doing these things, I actually think of Blabber. When Blabber is at his like apex, I think it's when he is able to invade, when he's able to farm super efficiently. Sometimes he's in his lanes, but I don't see him like a Contracts or like a River. River in particular is like the opposite, right? Where he will sometimes actively not farm in order to go to one of his lanes. And so I think one thing that has been kind of interesting, and this is not blaming Blabber, by the way, it's a playstyle thing. I think C9 has obviously been really dependent on having winning lanes and using those winning lanes to do certain things. One of them is Blabber counter jungling, even when the meta had shifted to a point where you are seeing more junglers affecting their lanes early. He was like the one, I remember Jat was tracking this in favor of his like Blabber for MVP for last summer. He was tracking this because he's like he's counter jungling and he's farming so efficiently in a meta that's like not as well suited for it as other metas. But I think in those cases, you're heavily reliant on your lanes winning. And I think in terms of pressure that C9 have had on the map, some of it is just drafting, like we already pointed out. But then this team is not looking very cohesive, in particular because their lanes are losing and they have a jungler who is not necessarily going to visit those lanes early, either based on picks or based on playstyle. And again, this is not flaming any one player. It's just this. Like, it's not though. It really
sounds
not.
like
It's
you're
just
flaming
like,
all of them.
kind of. Yes, actually. We'll just go with that.
Yeah.
We're flaming all the players. And I also think when you look at, because we were having a discussion partially on camera and partially off camera, when you have drafts like, for example, I really liked the Vayne mid pick into the Scion. I've been really vocal about how much I actually really enjoyed that. There's always this argument of like, should you lock in things where you have the faith that your hands are just going to get it done, right? And this has been a discussion not just about C9, but about like when T1 would like ego draft, and people would be like, this might not be the best draft, but they can get away with it because they have hands. And that's actually one of the things I really have loved about this current G1 team, which kind of makes me a gremlin, but it means that sometimes I
Just
am
watch
gonna like some
LPL.
eco drafts. Yeah,
Just watch
that's one of the
LPL.
reasons to like LPL, right?
So yeah.
But like I think when that suddenly doesn't work, then you have a problem, and not just with one aspect. You then have a problem with everything kind of coming apart at the seams.
I think yeah, it's I remember it's funny because I was petitioning for JoJo MVP, right? Pretty hard at around the same time. And part of my argument, I guess, was also that Blabber is basically benefiting a lot from his lanes winning, more or less on their own. And I think that the C9 identity was very clear because they didn't even necessarily win early game. They played for team fights last summer. They scaled, played for team fights, very little jungle interaction with the lanes, just from a scouting perspective. And then like Berserker was just the best team fighting ADC in the league. There was not really comparison, and so that's like kind of how they were winning their games. So for me, it was when this roster came out, and I did say this in like my power rankings video that I didn't publish to YouTube because it was very scuffed. But I did.
Oh, I was gonna say, ooh, power rankings video. I didn't see this.
It's on my Twitch channel if you go through the backlogs.
Oh, nice. I'll have to check it out now.
I did say that I think my biggest concern with C9, while I thought that their team was going to mostly be cohesive, was that JoJo and Blabber have very different approaches to the game in terms of like how mid jungle works. I think one of the big things, because you talked about jungle proximity, was JoJo had like the greatest enemy jungle proximity and probably also the greatest own team jungle proximity in summer, at least for a while. I know after a bit that particular stat went down, but it was, you could, like, the game basically became about JoJo, about the jungle playing around JoJo. There were times where that was just kind of the default thought process, and then JoJo would even have to say no, go away, to his own jungler, right? So, but the I think my favorite moment in the game, the losses so far from C9, was watching Armeo Ivern just like full clear on repeat and then go mid on every window where JoJo had like an all in, and it's like, you know, he's gonna get on, and he just throws the bushes and the shield, because that's what he did for JoJo every game, was he would like throw the bushes and like and leave, and then JoJo would win the 1v1, right?
That was hilarious.
So I think that that was like something that I really enjoyed. And then also noticed like two of their losses, like former junglers that have played with JoJo, right? And will know kind of like how he behaves and how he'll play with jungle. So I think that interaction has been very interesting. I also think in general this meta is kind of rough for a lot of the C9 players. And I think, like, obviously Fudge has been a good sport and played tanks a lot in the past, but this is a situation where that's basically what we're playing in LCS. And I think a lot of that is attributed to people still not figuring out how to play like 1-4 or 1-3-1 on the map. It's just not, it's like hard. There are too many openings and the lanes are too long in certain parts. So I think it will be figured out, but right now it's kind of not. The other element of it is just like tank itemization, which we've touched on before. And then like for bot lane, like Vulcan will want to play the hard 2v2. Berserker spent last split basically playing scaling, and then he was always good in the hyper carry like Zeri Lulu meta. And then that's an interesting one, and seeing them play like Lucian Melio is just very funny to me in a way, because I just don't expect Vulcan to play Melio well, and I don't expect the two of them to, and then I don't really think of Berserker 1v9 Lucian from a laning perspective, right? I don't think his laning his Lucian is like technically bad, but that's not necessarily the way that they've approached the game. So for me, it's just there's a lot of kind of kinks to iron out. on the team in terms of how they're going to synergize going forward. But the system should be there. And it feels like they change their approach every game because it's like one game we're going to go Blabber Rel and he's going to full clear. And that's not going to work. And then the next game we're going to go Jojo Oriana and give Blabber a full clear champ. And that's not going to work either. So for me, like the big thing is finding a way to make it work. I almost think that they could play like Shopify Rebellion, because Jojo can play like the engage angles and like the all-in angles on like the types of mid tanks, and then you could just do the Lilia farm whatever you want. So it'll be very, I think that they have solutions, right? It's just about finding one, which is why I think the break is going to be very helpful for them, and that's sort of my expectation there.
Yeah, I actually like if you ask me about like NRG and C9, because I guess just because of the loss to IMT, I saw a lot of people talking about like, oh man, like not only is C9 struggling, but NRG are struggling. I actually think both of these teams will be fine.
Is NRG struggling?
Especially
they had like
comes playoffs. Yeah, I don't think they are.
A but bad game or something.
Saying,
no,
I'm repeating. I'm repeating something I saw just literally after the IMT game, and I think we've already talked about that draft and their actual macro and approach. So I'm not gonna dwell on it, but yeah, I think C9 should be fine. I agree that the break will probably help them. I still need to hard study up on 14-3 because we're going to be on that.
Yeah, let's go.
Coming this week. And then we go on
Smolder Pog.
Little mini break. Yeah, Smolder. Smolder is interesting, I'll say. Smolder is definitely one of those champions where people don't like to play it until they do, essentially, because like if you talk to a lot of pro players, they never want to lose lane prio. But once you get 225 on Smolder,
it's just
you just absolutely shit damage. So
it's
like,
just very funny to
trade-off.
me that the Vigar main, who's an LCS staff member in LCS, Vigar V2, is the biggest proponent of Smolder because of course you love
let's go.
You love bot lane Smolder. You love bot lane Vigar basically in Smolder form. I think
that actually, wait, that's so perfect.
Yeah.
That's so perfect.
Yeah. So it's very, I think it'll be fun. Like also it's funny for the NRG C9 that they're the ones that it's on paper, they're the ones struggling with draft a bit, because based on rumors, NRG lose every scrim. And based on rumors, C9 win every scrim. And either situation, sometimes it's difficult. Well, lately, not as much, but based on like either situation, it's sometimes hard to decide what's good for your team on stage, because it doesn't seem to matter what you do in practice. It either works out or doesn't. It works out always, or it works out never. So, it's a little bit funny. There was a question in chat before we move on to this topic. The Cody Bowman asked if they think that LCS would benefit from BO2s with a points format. So weighted results. So specifically, so like 3 points for a 2-0 that they used to have in LPL. 1 point for 1-1.
I mean, I'm like the wrong person to ask. And I also think you are too, because we've both been vocal proponents of best of twos. I think I have talked to people about this because I myself do not feel this way, but I know a lot of people feel this way, because like regular season to me is seeding for playoffs, right? A lot of it is just literally seeding for playoffs. Like you're playing games. Obviously, we're reacting to it literally on this show. We just had an entire discussion like what's wrong with C9. But like the ultimate goal is you're seeding for playoffs, right? and maybe that's just coming from a traditional sports background where outside of the NFL, seasons are just really freaking long. So like obviously you're gonna drop games. But the thing that I have run into talking to people about best of twos, which again, this is not my personal opinion. I like best of twos. I think we'd benefit from best of twos. But a lot of people as a viewing experience find them really unsatisfying.
The reason why I would say I could push for like BO2 or BO3, unfortunately, like players and fans kind of hate BO2. But I think BO2 is fun, especially if you like hype up the points element of it. Like you had the very funny storylines like IG going 1-1 so many times that they actually had a super low seed despite like winning more games overall than other teams. So I found that storyline was like really funny to me because it's so IG, and so you can still get a viewer experience that way. But at the same time, like the reason why I would advocate for like more expanded format now is the main argument in terms of viewing experience in the past was like no one wants to watch 3 games of IMT versus Dignitas. And I think with fewer teams, like 8 teams, you're more likely to get this parity situation, as much as I don't necessarily think it's like super real right now, but you're more likely to get like a competitive bottom 2 teams. So I think that it's more realistic at this point. I also think BO3 is bad for like scheduling for viewer experience because the time of the match starting is variable. Yeah. But I prefer BO2 for so many reasons, but I know a lot of people don't like them, so that's why I also throw BO3 in there.
I think with the overall focus of LCS, especially with like the turnaround times, the pre-recorded draft being like, in my opinion, pretty successful in terms of a community win, like getting to the games very quickly. I think the priority for the viewing experience is definitely to have the most entertaining format for what the audience wants to see. And yeah, the thing I always run into with best of twos is people are like, but no one wins. And I'm like, yeah, but they could still, like any argument I come up with, people are just like, but no one wins.
But no one wins. Yeah.
Like I
the viewer wins.
Yeah, exactly.
The viewer wins.
But I agree with you that I despise variable start times. I think they're really, really bad. So that is like, unfortunately, one thing that you run into when you do best of threes. You essentially have to schedule them either at different venues or at different places within the same studio, which will never happen again. I don't think they'll ever do a concurrent stream. But then on top of that, or you have to schedule them so that there is time enough for 3 games, but sometimes you'll only get 2. So like what the LEC, or not what the LEC does, what the LPL or the LCK, wow, my brain, the LCK does right now, where you have a set start time and a set start time. Yeah, I just need to run through the league until I get to the right one.
Just eventually.
Like my grandparents yelling at my aunts and uncles and my mom, like my grandmother would just run through all of the names until she found the one she wanted to yell at. The LCK does set start times for their BO3s. So you'd have to do it like that too.
I'm down for Emily Rand, LCS Grandma branding. Let's go.
Yeah, let's go. I have the bun on top of my head.
Yeah, it's great.
I have the giant glasses. Yeah.
And okay, so I think we'll move on from that topic. One thing that did come up, and I was actually going to segue from the C9 topic because people want to fire Bithy. And the rumor was that Sheep Esports, published by Sheep Esports, is that Yamato is already removed from Team Heretics. So just not Team. Sorry, wow. I keep calling them Team Heretics. I don't know why. KCorp. YamatoCannon is removed from KCorp. So I'd be very curious.
They gave an official statement.
Yeah.
KCorp.
Oh, they did? Okay. I did not see the official statement.
Winter split. Yeah, they just tweeted it. I just saw it.
Okay.
Like a little while ago, and I clicked on it because I was like, oh, Following the winter split, we met to decide how to approach the rest of the season. At the end of a long analysis of the situation, which began during the split, we made the decision to change the current structure of the coaching staff by appointing, I'm going to butcher this person's name and I'm really sorry about it. Rahareha? Reha?
This will be a fun part of the show that will probably cut out for the YouTube. Let me see if I can find it.
I'm actually really sorry. I hate when I get names wrong. I like to research them to say them correctly. It's actually something that really means a lot to me because when you've been yelled at a lot by high school moms of high school kids in Vermont when you're a sports writer and you're trying to get everyone's name spelled
I would
correctly.
say,
like I know it actually means a lot to me. Anyway, I hate fucking up people's names. I'm really sorry. To the position of head. So Reha is going to the position of head coach. She'll be assisted by the staff already present during winter split. This choice results in Yamato being placed on the bench and withdrawn from his duties as head coach of the LEC team. To this day, we continue to speak with Yamato and his agent to determine what his future will be and the role he'll have in the club.
It's funny that I see this quote tweeted by Grab saying "You're not French." By anyway.
Oh God, I love Grabs.
Yeah.
As an aside, but yeah, I'm sad because I actually thought KCorp drafts on the whole not bad. Like actually, if Yamato was behind those drafts, I thought some of them were pretty good. So, I don't know. I don't know what the situation is. I don't know if it's one of those things where they feel like they have to do something because their results, and this is what they decide to do. A lot of times in traditional sports, they'll just trot out the head coach and kind of shove them on that sword. So it could be one of those situations. I
would argue that
I actually liked a lot of the KCorp drafts, so I didn't.
I mean, this may be a controversy.
At least from a draft perspective, I did not see a huge problem with Yamato's drafting.
This may be a controversial opinion, but I actually think only about 10% of a coach's job is draft. So a lot of times people will say, okay, I like the draft or I don't. For me, there are very clear internal issues with that team functioning. And that is also a coach problem. So a lot of people will say, oh, it's not his fault that Targamas doesn't talk or whatever the prevailing stuff that I see on Twitter. But also, in some ways, it kind of is. And this is like coming from someone who has had players who don't talk, and it's very difficult to get them to talk, and it's kind of impossible. But, you know, like at the end of the day, you're midway through season. A lot of times you have the coach take responsibility, and that's just part of the job. Coaching is arguably the worst job in esports because there's no real public way of assessing the coach, and there's also no real managerial way of assessing the coach. It's a lot of work, and it doesn't have nearly as much of the profiler exposure as being a player, right? So yeah, it's sometimes that's literally just getting fired as part of your, when things go wrong, it's literally just part of your job. And I think that's also in the traditional sports thing as well. So yeah, I think it's like, to me, I don't necessarily hate Yamato or think everything is his fault, but it's just kind of one of those things that you expect to happen. Especially between like a spring and summer, it's usually easier to replace a coach than it is to replace a player. So, yeah. But I do think that they should consider making additional roster changes as well. Because there's clearly issues with how the team is functioning. That maybe is not completely changed by a coach. But who knows? Maybe it is. Maybe Reha will fix everything. And the team will continue to play around top. Base KCorp playing around top. Let's go. Fun times.
To be continued.
All right. The topic that was actually requested by chat last night was to go over the Game 2 draft between Team Vitality and SK Gaming.
Oh, the Niski Lucian draft.
Yeah, so this was, to me, the reason, like on paper, the reason this draft happened is because they picked Lee Sin mid into Akali, which a lot of Akali players would hate. So they just flexed the Akali top. And then the Lucian ended up going mid to match the Lee Sin. And that's like kind of how it played out. It's a bit scuffed, but I think the main topic that would be worth discussing is like, is how beneficial is it to be flexible like this? Especially since we aren't seeing a lot of flex picks right now as the norm.
I mean, I actually think it can be really beneficial. Obviously, definitely did not work in this game.
Yeah.
But in terms of like an example where you kind of see it working was that 100 Thieves game, right? Where they flex the Aatrox away from the Cassante into the Scion mid and then had Sniper play Olaf. So I think like there are situations where like this can work. And I actually think for how many picks in LCS, and this could just be because a lot of the times the lounge champ select. So for those who haven't been watching LCS, we as the lounge do 2 champ selects because our turnaround times are so short. Casters need to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
So yeah, which I love because I love doing draft. I think draft is always like super interesting to me. So, but we tend to do a lot of Shopify games. So I have this perception of draft from LCS drafts that when you're looking at champions come across, you have to keep certain things in mind in terms of where they could be flexed. And again, part of this is just because maybe I've watched too many Shopify Rebellion drafts where they tend to have Insanity playing some weird stuff or the
Scion's going
elsewhere.
mid. It's not a flex pick.
But now we know the Scion's going mid. And like even in the NRG game when they locked in Maokai, both me and Raz are like, okay, we think that's a Huhi Maokai actually, not a Contracts Maokai. So a lot of times based on the team, you can tell. But you have to keep these options open, right? I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen more flex picks come out between mid and top. Obviously, like the main ones that we would see previously were like flexing the Cassante mid, depending on lane matchup. But I actually think there are different options for flexing between top and mid. I think the main reason that we're not seeing it as much right now is just because we end up having situations where a lot of the times mid laners are picked as one of 3, right? So it's Azir, it's Orianna, or Corki a lot of times. I would say Azir, Orianna more than anything have kind of emerged as like the 2 main ones. And then those are a lot more difficult to flex to top lane unless you're like Xiaohu
Azir
or the
for
Shy
sure.
or something.
You can flex the top, I'm just saying. But most top laners don't play it. And a lot of mid laners can't play the long lane. So, yeah. Well, now mid lane is long. So, who knows?
There you go. There's fewer gank angles. But yeah, like I actually think we could be seeing a lot more creativity coming out of being able to flex between those 2 positions. One of the reasons we're just not seeing it is because a lot of times mid lane champs are like set. And then the rest of the draft is where you might see more creativity. Outside of Shopify.
I think what feels strong is like tank tops, which most people don't want to put mid because they would rather have like some sort of damage source. But if you're Udyr, you are a damage source. So I'm actually really surprised we haven't seen the Udyr mid. Like when I first saw the Scion,
because he shoves so hard.
When I first saw the Scion Udyr draft, I thought it was Insanity Udyr mid and Scion top. That was like my expectation. Especially since like I think Fake Odds Scion is legitimately cracked And that's a weird thing to say about a Scion, but it is true. The other thing that I think is you're putting like more immobile mages in mid lane, but again, like both lanes are harder to gank now. So there's a chance that you could see like an Orianna top, and it wouldn't be that weird. Because you have like some level of protection, that some more level of more safety that could exist. So I think that there's in arguably more options for flex picks at the moment, and it's just not the traditional flex picks that you think of, like the Akalis and stuff. So we aren't seeing as many people attempt them. The
Yeah.
the other element is I don't know how this Akali like did so well in lane, because I was watching the game and I went over it and Photon took like this really egregious trade, and I was just very confused by how the laning phase went on top. I also know there was like some jungle intervention, but I expected the Akali to have like a tougher time.
Yeah.
And then, like, for me though, in general, you have a brand jungle and a Lee Sin. No matter where you put the Akali at that point, like she's going to have a difficult game. So it wasn't necessarily like a mid lane specific thing. It's just this was a very smart draft against an early pick Akali, coming out of Team Vitality. I don't even think you need to have like a Lee Sin mid. I think brand and some kind of CC is still just sufficient. So yeah. The Lee Sin was slightly better executed than the Lucian, so that also happened. I guess anything else on this topic, since I think we should be winding down.
No, I do hope we see more, because like specifically I'm thinking, and it also just depends on if they have shared champ pool, right? But like one of the best iterations of NRG, like the NRG core that we have right now, is when Palafox and Dokla would just share a lot of very similar champions, so they would be able to flex between top and mid. And given how you have Huhi, who is also willing to play a lot of different things, you have FBI, who is a Senna player as well as a traditional AD carry player and has been known to shake things up in bot lane as well. Like if you keep that dynamic, and they're actually only one of two teams to trot out the Jace as well.
Yeah.
For it's only been for Dokla top, and then the other team playing it is IMT for Mask mid because it's one of his best champs. But I think there's a lot of flexibility there. I think overall, we've seen a little bit more flexibility from LEC winter playoffs, specifically with the mid lane. I actually went through because I was really curious and I saw this was going to be a topic where obviously there's way more games that have been played in LPL and LCK as opposed to LEC and LCS. But if I'm looking at the champion picks across the entire season, mid for LCK is tied with the fewest unique picks. LPL mid has the fewest unique picks.
Yeah.
LEC regular winter season had the fewest unique picks in mid. And then
They're
LCS
so little games.
is being boosted by the fact that Insanity has played different champions in mid, and also like the one-offs like the JoJo Vayne as well, that's in there.
The very successful JoJo Vayne.
Yeah, I think I mean I'll defend it as a pick. I thought it was good into Zion. I'll stand by that. I think the big thing coming out of, and obviously LCS has had way fewer games, so we actually have the lowest champ diversity in bot. But one thing that's been interesting to see from the going from LEC regular season to LEC winter playoffs and looking at pick bans is actually they've branched out a bit in the mid lane. And some of that is coming from the fact that Caps is more than willing to play Hui
Yeah.
and bring Hui out. But that was kind of an interesting thing that started occurring in LEC winter playoffs, and I'm kind of hoping that continues. Because again, Azir has had the stranglehold for too long. We must fight back against him.
You have Jensen just playing Tristana because he's bored of Azir, basically. You know, it was fun. The yeah, like we saw more Hui in LPL last night. Finally, also, so that was cool. I'm very curious about and I would expect LEC to have like low in regular season because they just have so few games. But I really enjoyed the kind of round 2 drafts because it feels like they've had a lot more time to workshop them with like basically the series having more weight, being more important in the second rounds, and also just like fewer teams to, in theory, prepare for. Though of course if you make the next round that's not necessarily true. But you also get like the tape on the team you're gonna face, right? So I think that's been very fun to see, and I've enjoyed watching LEC, like even though they had the really one-sided series, more this week than I did in the past, just because it does feel a lot more important. And a lot more like teams are willing to try things. So yeah.
I really appreciated a lot of again, like this is one of them where obviously it didn't work out. But like the Lucian mid draft and flexing the Akali top, but the 4 pick of, because right, it was Lee Sin 4 on blue for Vitality, Leon 5 with SKR for Akali. Like that is such a cool response, especially when you already have a brand jungle who will just do insane amounts of damage. So I like really appreciated that flex coming out of Vitality, and like it was a cool. It was a very cool draft thing. There were some neat draft things in today's games that we just saw. I'm pointing at my TV for no reason because it's right over there, and I was just watching LEC. But obviously, like the Zac top coming out of Broken Blade was like really, really fun. We've seen that in other regions as well. But yeah, LEC winter playoffs have been really fun to watch thus far.
I think the big one for me on the brand jungle that's been hard for me to get behind is just it feels like you have like this double ranged mid jungle, and it's also like the Lilia with the mages mid, and that has just felt like when you're typically running like a Lilia or a brand, you want some kind of like lockdown or something like that, or some kind of like displacement, anything that can kind of just help you land your initial combos. So from that perspective, I also appreciated it. Yeah. But people are asking about like Zac top and LCS, if that's something that we think can get picked. I think Zac is like kind of underplayed in general, just considering how good he is with the tank items. We did see the Zac mid.
We saw Zac top too. Castle played it. He lost
Castle
with
also
it,
played it.
We saw it.
Yeah. So I do think we'll see more of it for sure.
And it was banned out, I believe, against IMT. I'm not sure if that also could have been them thinking that Ole might pick support as well.
Maybe, yeah.
But yeah, it was banned against them by NRG in their series as well. And previously Castle had played it.
Yeah. So I think it's like, again, I've had this conversation. It's like when Udyr is available, it just feels like other tanks are shittier. So, but once Udyr is not available, and even to an extent, like when he is, there's definitely still options that are very oppressive. It's just like the idea of blinding something that sometimes sucks. So if it's like a Zac or a flex pick, like Zac can be flexed in theory. So then, like, maybe it opens up a bit more. I'd really like to see more jungle top flexes. I think that would be another way that, like, LEC does the Jax, for example. Even though I think now many people would argue Jax jungle is just better, but we'll see. And the Gragas Jax, that was like the last game today, I think.
Yeah.
Double flex, like stuff like that, I think would be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Before we close up, we have to revisit Emily's boiling hot take.
Woo! This ended up being a terrible take.
Yeah. That DK would not only take the HLE, but that Lucid would completely mechanically dumpster and destroy Peanut. Absolutely.
Did not happen. I mean, yeah, I am not sure how in depth you want me to get into the series, but I kind of knew it was over.
Yeah.
As soon as they lost to Kwangtung Freaks earlier in the week, I was like, oh no. I don't know if they'll be able to get it together in time to take out HLE. I still think HLE have their issues that have not changed since I last talked about them, so I'm not going to go into those because we talked about that last week. But yeah, basically what happened was like Kwangtung played this Senna Nautilus against them, and they drafted almost the exact same composition because they're basically like, yoink, we'll just steal your homework. And then they didn't do double support items for question mark reasons. We don't really know. It's kind of broken because they were still on 14.1b. So I don't know why you don't do that. Just because it is, it's just so efficient. It gives you so much gold.
Yay.
Anyway. But yeah, it was not great. So like game 1 was like boof. Game 2 was a lot closer. They very easily could have won that game if it weren't for some mistakes. So as you hear, my dog is super upset about this too. He's actually upset about the rain, but he's also upset about HLE DK because I was super wrong, right? So they got 2-0'd. Again, game 2 was winnable. Game 1 was a little sus in a lot of situations. The taking this composition that they lost to and then trying to play it when they didn't really seem to understand how it worked. We did have the headlining Kingen on his Aatrox versus Zeka on his Akali, and spoilers, Zeka Akali won. So I do think when HLE have Zeka on something he's super comfortable with and he's succeeding, they're going to look a lot better because he has been kind of one of their sore spots, even in their wins that have looked really shaky. So he came out and had a good game 1. His Corki was a little sus in spots, but he did steal Baron. So,
nice.
You know.
It
was good.
I did want to say
it was not good. I totally lost. I was terrible at predicting that series.
I will say Lucid looked all right. So he
was fine. It was not
the hot element of your take. So we could actually
also didn't go in and didn't go in mechanically dumb.
I mean, one could argue that the hot part of your take was actually more lukewarm than the lukewarm part of your take.
Actually, the hottest part of my take was that DK were the better team and they were not the better team, but Lucid was fine. So
yeah. All right. So
it's not his fault.
Now that we've realized,
I'm so bitter about this,
that the repercussions of having a hot take are not so extreme. I think you've already had a hot take this episode, Emily, which is that all of C9 are terrible. So, would you like to elaborate further?
That could be my take. Okay. Oh my god. I think individually as players, they're all good. I'm trying to think of what my lukewarm take is for this. I should have thought of this before we started. Because now I don't really have one. Let me look at the schedule for Usually I just like pick a matchup and I'm like, oh man, here's what's gonna happen.
It's gonna be insane.
Maybe I can do something that I'll call out on broadcast for LCS. Let's see. What are the matchups coming up this week? We've got.
I mean, there's some good ones, right? There's Energy,
upset?
C9. I think 100 C9. There's a possible boiling hot
100
take.
Thieves are gonna dumpster C9.
Nice. Yeah.
That's a fun one.
I mean, I could see that one for sure. Unironically, if C9 continue to play like they're playing, I don't even think that's hot. I think that would be a lukewarm take too. Anyway,
that would be a lukewarm take. I would also want to see the draft, honestly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's weird. Is it weird that I feel like NRG are gonna lose to C9? Even though I think NRG are playing better right now.
Yeah, that might be.
I feel like
might be more. Of
I feel like that's kind of a hot take. Is like I actually think
Yeah.
C9 will get it together against NRG specifically, which is actually made hotter by the fact that I don't know where my perception of this is coming from, seeing as NRG have looked like the better team even in their losses in this regular season, except to their loss against C9, and beat C9 in finals in another situation where I was expecting C9 to kind of run over them. So maybe that'll be my hot take, is that C9 are going to get it together against NRG specifically.
As Munchables
for no reason other than vibes and the fact that they beat them in week 1.
As Munchables would say, it's about the mojo, you know?
It's about the mojo, yeah. I've never understood the mojo. I know he says it a lot, but
it's a TS don't make any sense, but they win because of mojo. That's basically
this take is not even coming from, because I will say I think NRG have looked like the better team, even in their especially in their losses. Actually, if you compare C9's losses to NRG's losses, I think NRG have some specific breakpoints in their losses that they're just going to want to revisit and be like, oh, this draft was more difficult to execute, and even though we had better macro, we lost. We messed up our bot lane.
So we'll see if the lukewarm take ends up being hotter, the 100 Thieves beat C9, or the hot take ends up being hotter, which is C9 beat 100 Thieves. All right. Any broadcast spoilers for this week or anything you want to shout out before we close down?
Shout out to pros again. Mm-hmm. It was Raz's turn. We've been cycling through, and we each kind of get to pick who we want to talk to and topics and stuff. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet because I was watching LEC and then prepping for this show, but it's been amazing because I think
it's a good show. I like it.
Yeah, when you have teams that are so stratified based on either fan bases or the only chance you get to see these people is on a specific team with specific other people, you forget that they have relationships with each other outside of their own team, and they have histories with each other, and it has been really cool to see pros just kind of shooting the shit with each other in this setting. It's been, I know in my episode I had a really fun time. I'm sure Raz had a great time with his. I know Jat had a great time with his. So just watch pros, because I think it's been a really good piece of content, and you get a lot of insight into how pro players think and either see the game or see the outside community reaction. And you also just realize that even as someone who works on the broadcast and is part of broadcasting is being asked to speculate about these relationships that you don't get to see. There's so much going on that you just don't know. And so this is kind of a slight peek into that.
Yeah. I mean, it's always again, working, I feel so weird because working with the team last year where every day you're kind of seeing the interactions and you know who's friends with who, XYZ. It's always easy to get mad at the broadcast and be like, but you don't know. But so pros is kind of a fun way to do that. And my favorite content when I was producing also was just content where you get interactions from players on different teams in general. Is always just so much fun to see. Because there's a bit of banter, but there's also camaraderie just by being like an LCS pro, and knowing what it's like. So that dynamic is always super cool. So yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, we will see you next week on Making the Rounds, and hope everyone had a great one.
Did I get a thumbs up? I don't know what. Wait, what the?
I don't know why it's just you.
Why is my
I've
computer
never seen
trolling
this.
me? What is going on? It has to be some.
That was perfect. All right.
Oh my god! All right, I'm taking a nap.
All
Because
right.
I've been up for way too long.